The first thing my father lost that night wasn't the wine glass. It was the story he'd been telling about me for 20 years. He'd been holding court at table 4, jacket unbuttoned, third drink in hand, performing the version of himself that country club ceilings bring out in men like him. Richard Hayes, Dayton contractor, self-made, broad-shouldered, comfortable with his own voice in large rooms. The crystal chandelier above him scattered light across the ballroom like something expensive and deliberate, and he was right at home beneath it. I was not. I'd arrived the way I always arrived at family events. Alone, quietly bracing. My overnight bag over one shoulder, my daughter Lucy's small hand in mine, and that particular kind of dread that only exists when you've spent 20 years becoming someone your family doesn't recognize. Lucy wore her flower girl ribbons and her tiny white shoes, and absolutely no anxiety about any of it, because she was 3 years old, and the world was still mostly made of cake and music. My father barely glanced up when we came in. "Well," he muttered, "you made it." My mother kissed my cheek quickly, the way she always moved kindness fast, before my father could notice it and make her feel guilty for it. Claire hugged me without wrinkling her dress and immediately checked whether I'd brought Lucy through the ceremony. When I confirmed she'd stayed in the childcare room downstairs, Claire's shoulders dropped half an inch with visible relief. My little sister had grown up in a different version of our childhood than I had. Same house, same dining table, same father, but the father Claire knew spent 40 years building a construction company and believed deeply that children were reflections of their parents' judgment. Claire reflected well. Posture, grades, sorority, the right friends, the right smile, the right husband. A Cincinnati attorney named Evan whose family donated to campaigns and vacationed in Portugal. She fit the frame he'd built. I had never fit the frame. After 9/11, while Claire was planning sorority rush events at Ohio State, I enlisted. My father reacted the way some men react to deep inconvenience, not with anger exactly, but with a kind of dismissal that hurt worse. That's where people go when they run out of better options. Grandpa Walter nearly came out of his chair at the kitchen table when he heard that. Old veterans understand certain insults in their bones. Dad never apologized. Over the following years, every deployment widened the distance. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, the slow accumulation of family Christmases that build the language families speak to each other. Then my marriage dissolved during my third overseas rotation. My husband had been patient longer than most men would have been, and then he wasn't anymore, and I couldn't blame him. By 36, I came home carrying a retirement, a preschooler, a pair of wrecked knees, and the particular insomnia that follows you out of combat zones and never fully goes away. To my father, that inventory translated simply, not dramatic failure, worse, quiet failure, the kind respectable families discuss after church. The humiliation at dinner was, in some ways, unremarkable. He'd been drinking since cocktail hour. The table included several of Evan's relatives, people I'd just met, and they asked politely what I'd done before retiring. Dad laughed before I could answer. "Rebecca," he said, waving his wine glass like he was batting away a minor inconvenience, "she's just a pathetic veteran. Spent years in uniform. Came home divorced, busted up knees, no real career. Now she's raising a kid alone, and living off army stories." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. That's the thing nobody tells you about humiliation. The worst kind isn't mockery. It's social laughter. The kind people produce when they want to stay comfortable, when they need the moment to pass. I sat there folding my napkins smaller and smaller beneath the tablecloth while my father publicly dismantled my life in front of strangers. Army training teaches emotional control better than most therapy. You learn to breathe steadily, hold your face neutral, let the moment move through you like weather. Mom stared at her plate. Claire studied her champagne glass. Nobody intervened. And somewhere inside me, I was 23 again, standing alone in an airport terminal after a deployment, trying to understand why coming home always felt lonelier than leaving. That was the version of the evening that existed until the ballroom doors opened. At first, nobody reacted. A shift in air, a door swinging wide, events like that have a half-second delay before the room catches up to what's happened. Then the whispers started in waves, traveling from the entrance outward across the ballroom like something contagious. "Oh my God, is that actually? That's Governor Mercer." Daniel Mercer walked in wearing a dark overcoat, his hand held gently by my 3-year-old daughter, who was leading him across the room with the absolute confidence of a child who has located something important. The music near the dance floor stumbled and stopped. Mercer scanned the room once, found me immediately, and smiled, not the photograph smile, not the handshake smile, but something warmer and more direct than any of that. He walked straight toward our table. Lucy pointed, "There's Mommy." My father's wine glass slipped from his fingers and detonated against the marble floor. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a starter pistol. Nobody laughed, not one person, because Governor Mercer, 3 terms, decorated Marine, the kind of man veterans instinctively straighten their backs for, had just stopped in front of my chair and was looking at me like I was the person he'd specifically come to find. "There you are, Captain Hayes." His voice was calm and warm. "Your daughter couldn't find you, she was worried." Captain Hayes. Not Rebecca, not Becca, not my daughter, the embarrassing one, my rank, my title, the one my father had spent the better part of an evening treating like a punchline. I caught Lucy against my chest, while the entire wedding reception held its collective breath. Mercer glanced around the table, at the shattered glass glittering on the marble, at my father's stunned white face, at the ring of frozen dinner guests. Then, politely, he nodded toward a nearby waiter. "Careful there, wouldn't want anyone getting hurt." The spell cracked, people began moving again, whispers spread table to table like a current. Dad stood up too fast and nearly knocked his chair over, forcing a smile, extending his hand. "Governor, what an honor." "I'm here for Captain Hayes," Mercer said. Not dismissively, not rudely, just plainly, like a man who had traveled a specific distance for a specific reason and wasn't confused about what it was. My father sat back down. Mercer took the empty seat beside me. Lucy climbed into my lap without being asked and rested her head against my collarbone, the way she did when she'd decided a situation was finished and it was now time to rest. Mercer looked at her with genuine warmth. "You found your mother after all." "I got lost," Lucy said seriously. "Happens to the best of us." Then he glanced at me, just 2 quiet words, "You okay?" And that nearly undid me right there at the reception table, because he asked it the way people ask it when they actually want to know the answer. Not as a greeting, not as a formality. I gave him a small nod. "I'm fine." He studied my face for a beat too long, and I understood he knew better, and I appreciated that he let it go. Claire's father-in-law leaned forward carefully. "How exactly do you know Rebecca?" Dad tried to fill the silence first. "Oh, I'm sure it's some army connection." "It's not," Mercer said. That shut the table down completely. He folded his hands on the white tablecloth. 3 years ago, he said, Eastern Kentucky flooded after record rainfall. Entire towns underwater within hours. Several guests nodded vaguely. They'd seen it on the news, the way people see most disasters, from a comfortable distance. Mercer's voice stayed even. His daughter and grandson had been trapped inside a community hospital evacuation zone. Roads collapsed. Emergency crews couldn't safely reach the building. Most people inside believed, with good reason, that they were going to die. Then he looked at me. Captain Hayes coordinated the evacuation. The room went a different kind of quiet. Not social quiet, the emotional kind, when people suddenly realize they may have spent the last hour badly misreading a situation. My father blinked. "You never told us about that." "You never asked," I said quietly, without cruelty, just fact. Mercer continued. Nearly 19 straight hours. Flood water reaching second-story windows before the final helicopter cleared the roof. Federal conditions assessments rated the operation as nearly impossible. He said it without drama, the way military men recount difficult things, straightforwardly, because the facts are already dramatic enough. My mother covered her mouth slowly with one hand. Claire stared at me like I'd become a stranger. My father looked like someone had struck him somewhere he hadn't expected. "Rebecca," he said, his voice unfamiliar to itself, "why wouldn't you tell the family something like that?" I met his eyes directly. Because every time I talked about military work, you treated it like I was trying to impress people. No one answered. No defense came, because there wasn't one that would survive the next 30 seconds. Mercer studied my father quietly. Most decorated service members don't talk much about what they've done, he said. They learned a long time ago that nobody wants to hear the difficult parts. I looked down at Lucy's small fingers laced through mine. The ballroom buzzed softly with conversations spreading outward from our table. People were watching. Gee me differently now, not with pity, not with amusement, with something I'd forgotten was possible in that room. Respect. It made me more uncomfortable than the humiliation had. Mercer reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded newspaper clipping. He passed it across the table to my father without a word. I recognized the photograph immediately. Me, standing knee-deep in floodwater beside a rescue helicopter, soaked through, holding an elderly woman wrapped in thermal blankets. I always hated that photograph. My hair was plastered flat, my face drawn with exhaustion. I looked exactly as bad as I'd felt. My office wanted to honor her publicly afterward, Mercer said softly. Dad looked up, she declined. She asked us not to, yes. My father stared at the photograph. His hands were trembling slightly. Why, he asked. Mercer didn't answer, he waited. Because I was tired, I said finally, of trying to prove my life mattered to people who'd already decided it didn't. The silence that followed that sentence was the longest one of the evening. Mercer leaned forward, not aggressive, not performative, just sincere in the way men are sincere when they've carried something long enough that they've stopped worrying about how it lands. Sir, he said quietly to my father, your daughter spent years becoming the kind of American most people only pretend to be. My father's eyes filled. And watching the loudest man I'd known my entire life suddenly look small at his own daughter's table, I understood something I hadn't expected to feel yet. He wasn't embarrassed of me. For the first time in his life, he was embarrassed of himself. The reception never fully recovered. The band tried, soft jazz drifted back through the ballroom about 20 minutes later, and waiters resumed moving through the room with champagne and crab cakes. But the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Before Mercer arrived, I'd been the cautionary tale tucked quietly beside the centerpiece. Afterward, people kept approaching the table with careful, searching expressions. Thank you for your service, I had no idea. My son was Army too. That's how older Americans talk when shame and admiration have gotten mixed together and they can't fully separate them. Quietly, respectfully, like they're trying to fix something without admitting what it is. Claire pulled me aside near the restroom corridor, her dress rustling sharply as she crossed her arms. Did you know he was coming? Straight to accusation, predictably Claire. You honestly think I arranged this? I looked at my sister. I spent 20 years trying not to attract attention in this family. Why would I suddenly orchestrate something like this? She looked away first. She knew I was right. We stood there in the corridor for a moment with the muffled music behind us, and something shifted between us. Claire's shoulders dropped the way they drop when someone lets go of a posture they've held too long. Tonight was supposed to be about my wedding, she said. Not angry anymore, just honest. I know, I said. I never wanted this to happen here. She studied me carefully, the tired set of my face, the way I held myself, the specific quality of exhaustion that accumulates over years rather than days. Maybe she'd never really looked at it before. Did things overseas really get that bad? She asked. The question was so gently, carefully formed, the way civilians ask about war, terrified the answer might detonate if handled wrong, that I almost didn't know how to answer it. I leaned against the hallway wall while distant jazz drifted through the doors. There are things you don't come back from completely, I said. Claire swallowed. Then, quietly, I used to think Dad was hardest on you because you were stronger. I looked at her sharply. He expected me to need protecting, she said, eyes still toward the ballroom, but he expected you to survive everything. Her voice was soft and a little sad. You were allowed to leave. That sentence followed me the rest of the night. Mercer said his goodbyes shortly after 10. Before he left, he bent down beside Lucy, who'd gone drowsy against my shoulder, and said something directly to her in a low voice. "Your mom is a hero." I felt tears threaten immediately. Not because of the word, I've never liked the word hero. Too simple, too clean, too far from what it actually feels like to carry an 18-year-old out of a burning vehicle or to stand on a hospital roof in 40-knot wind and decide whether the next run is survivable. But he said it to my daughter the way people say things that are simply, plainly true, like Lucy should grow up already knowing it. Dad barely spoke for the rest of the evening. By 10:30, guests were filtering out. Claire and Evan departed through sparklers and applause. I slipped toward the coat room with Lucy wrapped in a borrowed blanket, her white shoes dangling against my hip. I almost made it to the lobby. "Rebecca." I turned. He stood alone near the fireplace, looking older than I'd ever seen him, not physically, but in the specific way men age when they've been forced to hold something true about themselves that they've been setting down their whole lives. Snow was falling beyond the glass entrance doors behind him, silently and without any drama. We stood there for a long moment, neither of us speaking. "I didn't know," he said finally. He meant it, that was the heartbreaking part, he genuinely meant it. "What exactly didn't you know?" I asked. He looked stunned that I asked, like he'd assumed the apology was the finish line rather than the beginning of a much harder conversation. "That your life turned out," he searched, "important." Important, not meaningful, not honorable. Important, like something that counts on a balance sheet. "My life was always important," I said quietly. "You just valued different things." His eyes filled immediately. "I pushed you because I thought it made you stronger." "No, Dad," I kept my voice even. "You pushed me because you thought I embarrassed you." He didn't argue, and the silence where the argument should have been was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever received from my father. I barely slept. Lucy and I stayed at a Hampton Inn 20 minutes from Columbus, the kind of place built beside highways where the heat hums all night, and every room smells faintly like stale coffee and industrial carpet. Lucy slept peacefully across the other bed, surrounded by stuffed animals and wedding candy. She'd somehow transferred from the reception to my overnight bag without my noticing. Children recover from emotional tension faster than adults. At 3, she thought the wedding had been excellent. Pretty dresses, cake, a nice man who helped her find her mommy. She had no idea she'd accidentally detonated 30 years of family denial, simply by holding a governor's hand. I sat by the window around 4 in the morning watching snow fall across the parking lot. Old army habit, even retired, the body maintains its own vigilance. You learn to sleep lightly, to listen, to stay loosely ready. The silence of civilian nights never fully becomes ordinary again. It always sounds slightly wrong, like a frequency that's just a little off. By 6, my knees had already registered the pressure system rolling in from the west. Old injuries predict Ohio winters better than meteorologists. Lucy woke at 7:30 asking for waffles, cheerful and untouched by any of it. Thank God for that. While she drowned breakfast in syrup and watched cartoons in the hotel lobby, my phone buzzed. One missed call from Mom. One text from Dad. "Can we talk before you leave town?" No preamble, no apology, just those 8 words. I stared at the screen for a long time, then I typed back, "We can meet after lunch." His reply came within seconds, "Thank you." My father had never thanked me for emotional space before. That bothered me more than anger would have. I drove us to Maple Street Grill outside Dayton, red vinyl booths, bad coffee, waitresses who called everyone hun. Grandpa Walter used to bring me there after Little League games because he hated country clubs and loved cherry pie. The place hadn't changed in 20 years, which was part of why I chose it. Dad arrived 10 minutes after us, still in his suit from the night before, a heavy coat over the top. He looked terrible, not drunk, which was almost worse. Sober and reflective. Regret has a physical weight in older men. You can see it in how they hold their shoulders. He hugged Lucy carefully before sitting across from me. For a few minutes, We hid inside safe conversation, dinosaurs, cartoons, preschool. Then the waitress took our orders and the shelter of small talk collapsed. "I owe you an apology," he said. I'd spent most of my adult life imagining how it would feel to hear those words from him. The honest answer is, it didn't feel like much. Old wounds don't close the moment someone names them, they just become wounds that have been named. "I embarrassed you publicly," he continued, "and I was wrong." "Yes," I said. He flinched. He'd hoped, on some level, that I'd soften the edge of it for him. That was always my role in this family, emotional shock absorber, the one who made difficult truths comfortable enough for everyone else to sit with. I was done doing that. When Mercer started talking last night, Dad said, looking out the diner window, I realized I don't know what your life has actually been. "You knew the parts you wanted to know," I said. He exhaled slowly. "You really believe I cared that little?" I looked at my father carefully, at the familiar architecture of his face, strong jaw, tired eyes, the gray that had moved in steadily over the past decade, and I decided that honest conversation mattered more now than comfort. "Yes," I said, "I do." The diner filled the silence with coffee cups and country radio and the distant groan of a snowplow. Duh. Dee rubbed his jaw. "I thought giving you space meant respecting your independence." "Claire got attention," I said quietly. "I got distance, those aren't the same thing." He looked down at his untouched plate, and I could see him absorbing it, the specific mathematics of how he divided himself between his two daughters. Claire had received encouragement, involvement, pride, emotional investment. I had received the assumption that I didn't need any of that. "I honestly believed you didn't need much from us," he said. That's one of the saddest parenting mistakes in America, I think, the quiet child becoming invisible because they aren't demanding anything loudly enough. As if love requires the recipient to perform their need for it. "I needed exactly what Claire needed," I said. "You just decided she deserved it more." His eyes filled. Before he could answer, Lucy looked up from her coloring mat. "Mommy cries in her sleep sometimes." She said it the way children say important things casually, while focused on something else. She says names, sometimes she says don't leave him there. The world stopped. Dad looked at her, then at me. I'd worked very carefully to keep my nightmares from Lucy. Kids are porous. They absorb what happens around them before they have language for it. Apparently she'd been absorbing this for a while. "Combat memories," I said quietly before he could ask. "They don't always stay where you put them." Dad stared at me for a long time. "How bad?" "Dad," I almost laughed. "I spent years loading 19-year-old soldiers into helicopters missing limbs." His face crumpled in a way I hadn't seen before. "You never told us. You never wanted difficult answers." He couldn't argue. He'd wanted the safe version of my service, patriotic stories, discipline, duty. Not the cost. Not the psychological invoice that arrives slowly over years and doesn't stop arriving. He'd never asked about the friends who stopped returning calls, the nights that still required 2 glasses of whiskey to approach, the specific way a thunderstorm can send you back to a place you haven't been in a decade. After a long pause, he said, "Your grandfather warned me." I went very still. "Walter told me years ago I was treating you differently. Said one day you'd stop trying to earn love from this family, and when that happened, I'd realize how much of your life I missed." Grandpa Walter, always seeing things clearly before anyone else. Dad stared at his hands. I think that day finally came last night. We stood in the diner parking lot afterward, snow crunching under our shoes, cold wind coming flat across the highway fields. Lucy was inside choosing candy from the machine near the register. Dad asked without warning, "When's the last time you were happy?" I stared at him. My father had never asked me anything emotional before in my life. I looked out across the snow-covered fields toward the gray horizon. "I don't know." He nodded slowly, like the answer had confirmed something. "When your grandfather came home from Vietnam," he said quietly, "he barely talked for almost 2 years. Used to sit in the garage pretending to work on things. Most of the time, he was just listening to baseball games on the radio. Your grandmother said he screamed in his sleep. I watched my father's face while he said this. I decided early that sadness made men weak, he continued, and I spent 40 years building a life around that decision. He paused. Then my daughter volunteers for a war, and every time she comes home, she looks, he searched, older, in a way I didn't know how to talk to. I said nothing. When you enlisted, I was terrified. He looked at me directly. I knew what military life did to your grandfather, and then suddenly you were choosing it voluntarily. His voice roughened. I think I was angry because I was scared, and I never told you the difference. That complicated something inside me, because pain becomes strange when you discover fear hiding underneath cruelty. It doesn't make the cruelty hurt less, but it explains the shape of it. Dad reached into his coat pocket. Your mother found this after the wedding. He held out an envelope. Walter left instructions to give it to you when the timing finally made sense. The handwriting on the front stopped my breath. Grandpa Walter's handwriting, still as recognizable as a voice, and the note on the front. For Rebecca, when she finally stops apologizing for who she became. My hands were cold inside my gloves. I opened it carefully. Rebecca. If you're reading this, life probably turned out exactly the way I worried it would. Your father loves hard work, appearances, and respectability because those things helped him survive his own fears. Fear has a way of making people emotionally blind, especially men who never learned another way. You and I were built differently. Some people survive difficult things and become harder, some survive them and become deeper. Dawn. Let anyone convince you the second kind is weakness. One day your father will realize that strength isn't loudness, or criticism, or control. Real strength is tenderness that survives disappointment. And Becca, if the world ever makes you feel small for serving others, quietly remember this. The people who carry the heaviest things rarely brag about it. I was proud of you long before anybody important learned your name. My hands were shaking by the time I finished. The only person who had ever truly understood me had been preparing me for this family my entire life. Writing letters he knew he might not be alive to deliver. Trusting that eventually, the moment would arrive when I needed to hear his voice more than I needed anything else. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest. Dad stood quietly beside me in the cold. He didn't ask what it said. He just waited, in the particular way people wait when they know they have a long way yet to travel. We stayed another 3 days. That surprised everyone, including me. My standard coping strategy had always been clean exits, leave before disappointment calcifies, before the weight of emotional neglect becomes too familiar to feel. Military life makes you good at exits. You learn to detach efficiently because attachment becomes expensive when deployments keep tearing your life apart every few years. But Grandpa Walter's letter sat in my coat pocket like unfinished business. And my father, for the first time in my memory, seemed genuinely afraid of losing me. Sunday dinner at the family house. Same dining room where Dad told teenage me I'd be prettier if I smiled more. Same kitchen where he laughed after I enlisted. Mom had cooked too much food, the way anxious mothers do when emotion overwhelms them: pot roast, mashed potatoes, biscuits, cherry pie cooling on the windowsill. Claire was already there in expensive cream-colored knitwear, her husband Evan at the table helping Lucy with crayons. Claire looked uncertain when I arrived, not hostile, uncertain, that was new. Dad stood near the kitchen counter, holding a salad bowl like he wasn't sure what to do with his own hands. Hey, he said softly. Hey. No explosion, no set pieces, just older people slowly, awkwardly, trying to find their way back to something. Dinner began cautiously. Weather, traffic, Lucy's dinosaur obsession. Then Claire set down her fork halfway through dessert. I looked up the Kentucky flood rescue. The room went quiet. The report said you went back onto the roof after the evacuation order ended. She looked at me carefully. That another helicopter pilot refused because visibility had collapsed. Dad looked at me sharply. One patient was still trapped upstairs, I said. You could have died, Dad said, not accusing, something closer to terrified. A lot of people could have died, I answered. You had a daughter already. I looked at Lucy, cross-legged beside Evan and laughing at something on a crayon wrapper. She had a smear of cherry pie on her chin. Yes, I said, that's why I went back. Nobody spoke. Sometimes civilians think courage is an absence of fear. Usually it's just responsibility wearing different clothes. Claire stared at her coffee. Then, you know what's strange, I used to be jealous of you. I looked at her. You got freedom I never had. Dad expected me to stay polished forever. She shook her head. Perfect daughter, perfect wife, perfect everything. She glanced toward Dad, then away. You were allowed to leave. Claire's. I know it wasn't easier, she said quickly. I know that now, she met my eyes. I just mean that the way he divided us, it damaged us both. Differently, but both. Dad looked at the table. I failed both of you in different ways. Nobody argued. Then the doorbell rang. Harold Bennett, 81 years old, Vietnam veteran, smelling faintly of motor oil and flannel and pipe tobacco, stepped through the front door carrying a cardboard box under one arm. There's my favorite soldier, he said warmly when he saw me. I hugged him harder than I meant to. Harold squeezed my shoulder. Your grandfather would have loved this mess, he said. Dad gave a quiet, tired laugh, that obvious from the driveway. In your family, frank emotional disasters are visible from the highway. Harold set the box on the table. Walter's things, photographs, service medals, handwritten journals, cassette tapes labeled by year, and newspaper clippings. I picked up the first one carefully. My promotion to captain, 15 years ago. Dad stared at it. You kept that. Walter bought 6 copies, Harold said. I couldn't breathe properly. I'd stood alone at that promotion ceremony, eating dry sheet cake beside officers whose parents had flown in. Nobody from my family had come. I'd told myself it didn't matter. Harold reached into the box again. He handed another clipping to Dad, my retirement ceremony. Dad unfolded it slowly. Taped inside, in my grandfather's handwriting. Frank, if you cannot see honor in your daughter's life, the problem is not her life. Dad covered his mouth with one hand. For the first time in my life, I watched my father cry without immediately trying to stop himself. Governor Mercer invited me to the Ohio Veterans Leadership Ceremony 2 weeks later. I almost declined. Old habit veterans who have spent years surviving quietly tend to treat recognition like a trap. But Harold called me. Your grandfather spent his whole life watching good people disappear into silence, he said. Don't make his mistake. So I drove to Columbus on a cold Thursday evening in my old dress uniform, Lucy in the back seat humming to herself. You look pretty, Mommy. Thank you, Bug. The Ohio State House Rotunda, marble columns, warm yellow light, mostly veterans, emergency responders, military families, real Americans who clap politely and mean it. Dad arrived with Mom 10 minutes after us. He wore his good gray suit, but something about him was different. The confidence that filled rooms had quieted into something more careful, more deliberate. When he saw me in uniform, he stopped for just a second, and I understood why. The version of me he'd spent years seeing was being replaced by one he'd never bothered to look at. Throughout the evening, people kept stopping me. Not celebrity attention, something quieter. Professional respect. The earned kind, built slowly through years of difficult work done without witnesses. A Navy veteran shook my hand firmly. Heard about Kentucky. Hell of an operation. A woman in firefighter dress blues told me her brother still talked about the hospital evacuation. A Marine colonel crossed the room to shake my father's hand. You Rebecca's father. Dad nodded. You raised one hell of an officer. I watched my father absorb that, and for the first time in my life, he didn't deflect it. Governor Mercer's remarks at the podium were brief and specific. He didn't use my name immediately, built to it slowly, the way good storytellers do, laying down context before the weight of the thing. When he finally got there, he said, Captain Rebecca Hayes did not withdraw. He spoke about the 19 hours, the conditions, the federal assessments. He spoke about the choices made at the edge of what was survivable. Then he paused. But what impresses me most about Captain Hayes isn't what happened during the flood. He looked toward me across the rotunda. It's what happened afterward. I stared at my hands. She returned home quietly, raised her daughter, lived modestly, asked for nothing, and continued helping other veterans find their way back to civilian life. Dad didn't know about the veteran counseling group. I'd never mentioned it. Mercer's voice found the sentence that broke my father completely. Captain Hayes represents the best kind of service, quiet sacrifice without bitterness. In my peripheral vision, I saw Mom reach for Dad's hand. The applause that followed was warm and long and completely real. Dad asked if we could step outside after the reception. We stood on the State House steps while downtown Columbus moved quietly below us, and snow drifted through the yellow streetlight. I spent years waiting for you to become someone impressive, he said. I let the silence hold. The truth is, his voice thickened. You became someone honorable, and I was too emotionally stubborn to understand that those aren't the same thing. That sentence reached somewhere old and sore inside me, because honor mattered to me in a way success never had. Honor was the thing I carried into every evacuation and tried to bring back out again. I think I owe your grandfather an apology, he said softly. I smiled at that, not happily but genuinely. You probably do. He laughed, the quiet kind. Then, after nearly 40 years of emotional distance, my father put one arm around my shoulder. Not gracefully, not cinematically, just a man trying, late and imperfectly, to close a distance he'd spent a long time building. Snow fell on Columbus. I leaned into it slightly. And standing outside the Ohio State House, holding my grandfather's letter in my coat pocket, I finally understood something I should have known years ago, that I had never needed my family to witness my service in order for it to have mattered. But it turned out, after everything, that being witnessed still meant something. Even now, even this late. Even here,